Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 3 of the CARES Act conference, also known as day 1 of CDBG CDBG-CV training. So glad to have you with us this morning. For those of you like Rudy and myself who are on the West Coast, please continue caffeinating, and we will go ahead and get started with our session this morning. My name is Dion Roberts, and I am the president and CEO of TDA Consulting. And I am happy this morning to be joined by Rudy Munoz, who is going to be my official partner in crime and try and keep me out of trouble this morning as we both continue to caffeinate. And Rudy will introduce himself as well. So Rudy, you want to say hey to the folks?
Good morning, everyone. Rudy Munoz. I am out in the Southern California area. So as Dion said, I had to make a quick stop to Starbucks to get ready for the session.
Great. Well, you keep caffeinating. I'll get us started and we will go ahead. I know this is the first of many sessions that you'll be in for the next 3 days, covering basically CDBG, CDBGCV. Just so that you know and you're aware, and hopefully you already are, there are 2 tracks, track A and track B, and it is the exact same session being delivered simultaneously in 2 tracks. So there's no reason for you to hop between them. You can stick with the same track the whole day. You can go back and forth in between individual sessions. You will have Rudy and I for the first couple of hours this morning, and then the trainers will switch up and then they'll switch up again. So the good news is you shouldn't get too bored and you won't be hearing the same voices over and over again. What you will be doing is using the same technology that you've already been using during the conference, and you will use that same technology over the course of the next few days. So did want to just start, especially for those of you who are newer to this construct, with a couple of quick housekeeping things. First of all, if you have colleagues that haven't been able to join or you are worried about missing something, don't worry. All of the presentations and webinar recordings will be available on the HUD Exchange. They won't be available, obviously, simultaneously to the event, but in the next couple of weeks, they'll all get posted, and hopefully you're subscribed to the eBlast and you will get the notification when they do get posted up to the HUD Exchange, and you'll be able to share them with all of your friends and colleagues who might have missed the opportunity, and be able and go back and look at them anytime yourself. We do have a national crowd in these sessions, and so for that reason, participants are going to be in listen-only mode. Doesn't mean that you can't ask questions, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. If you're looking for closed captions, they can be viewed using the show captions feature in the video player. So that is an option if you're looking for that. And if you're looking for any other information, please do take a look at the attendee guide, which is on the resources page of that main event space that you came into this morning. So there's a lot of information there if you're just trying to get sort of a broader view. As I said, even though everybody's muted, you can absolutely ask questions, and we encourage you to ask them as we go. You don't have to wait until the end. We will be taking a look at them and kind of triaging them as we go along, but want you to ask your questions as they occur to you, because otherwise you kind of run the risk of A, forgetting your question and not asking it, or you're so focused on remembering it that you're losing all of the other conversations. So go ahead, submit your question. You might have to scroll down to see the Q&A, but please do go ahead and submit it as we go. As I'm speaking, Rudy will be keeping an eye on it, and vice versa. So they will not be left unattended by us. If you have technical issues, so not content issues, but if you have technical issues with the system or your side of it, you can get help through the chat box. There is an amazing technical team that has been with us since Monday morning, keeping us going. And so please use the chat. They are here and are ready and able to help you as we go along. We will have just a couple of polls this morning to kind of get us going. If you've been participating in the last couple of days, this will not be your first go round with polls. Do answer any polls that come up. The participation is really helpful to us. And again, just keep in mind that in the web page, all of these things are going to be located below your viewer. And so you might have to scroll down when you're looking for them. You may also want to have two screens going, but that's a little fancy for me. I know people are doing that. It's a little fancy for me, but you might want to do that because then you can see the questions on one side and the live presentation on the other screen. So with that, let's go ahead and again, just go ahead and scroll down so that you're going to be able to see our poll. And we're going to go ahead and start the first poll, just kind of getting a sense of who's in our virtual room with us this morning. So obviously, CDBG is the starting point, but this is the CARES Act conference and specifically about CDBG-CV. So go ahead and answer the question about sort of what your understanding of CDBG-CV is. And I love the one that says you can cite it in your sleep, because if you're reading the Federal Register notice, it is probably putting you to sleep. So pretty accurate in terms of where you might run into it in your spare time. So it looks like so far we've got a pretty solid mix. Lots of beginners, ton of folks who have a little bit, not so many people who are willing to admit that they're experts. We're not going to hold you to it. It's okay. You can go into the expert box and then change your mind later on if you want. But it looks like for the most part, most people have some experience. So the good news for those of you who are in the newer category is that we're going to cover all of those basic differences and make sure that they're talked about. So you'll get a really good sense of that. And for those of you who are already familiar with it, it will give you an opportunity to ask those nudging and annoying questions that you've been trying to get figured out, or things that you haven't quite been sure about. So I do think that even if you are comfortable with it, you will still get a lot out of the next few days. So thank you for participating. Good to see so many people are on with us so early in the morning. We can't see the attendee numbers, so that was also an opportunity for us to see if we were talking to ourselves or if somebody had joined us. So really good to see that we already have a few hundred people joining us this morning. Amps up the pressure a little bit, but that's okay. We're good with pressure, okay? So we will go ahead and jump into the overview. And again, this first session this morning is truly that. It is a high-level overview, just talking about kind of what the program is, how we got here, what some of the basic considerations are. And then Rudy's going to spend some time talking about the planning process, from consolidated planning through action planning and capers, all your favorite things. And then, as you've seen from the agenda, each session over the next few days will continue to build, where you will hear more about specific activity types, national objectives, other federal requirements, or also known as cross-cutting, financial management, all those really important things. So this is just literally kind of easing in to the conversation. And it's important to note that when we talk about CDBG-CV, it's probably pretty obvious that it's related to the Community Development Block Grant Program, right? The little dash with the extra 2 letters at the end is a pretty good giveaway of that. But I say that because, like many other programs like NSP and CDBG-DR, the Community Development Block Grant Program is really the foundation for the CDBG-CV program. So when we were working with neighborhood stabilization and when we work with disaster recovery, we always start by talking about the fact that all of this comes out of the Housing and Community Development Act of '74. So that is the baseline. HCDA and 24 CFR Part 570, which is the regulation around CDBG, are the starting point for the program. And so these are the rules, the statute and the regulations that govern what we call kind of the regular program, the entitlement program, the formula program, and they form the bedrock foundation from which CDBG-CV, NSP, disaster recovery sort of grow up from. So it's always the starting point when we start these conversations. And then what you'll see is we will kind of veer off and talk about the uniqueness related to the CARES Act. So what's the baseline foundation that comes from CDBG? And then what are the additional considerations or flexibilities that come with the CARES Act funding? The primary objectives of the Community Development Block Grant Program itself, so again, starting with that as the foundation, are three things. And these come again from the statute, from the Housing and Community Development Act of '74, which says that the whole reason the program exists is for the development of viable urban communities, principally, but not solely, for low and moderate income persons through three avenues: decent housing, suitable living environment, and expanded economic opportunity. When you get to the session that talks about national objectives, these will sound eerily familiar because you'll be talking about things like low mod housing and low mod area and low mod jobs. And those all come from the national objectives, which are in the regulation, start from the statute, right? The statute comes first, and then the regulation gets developed. And so in the statute is where it was laid out and promulgated that housing, living environment, and economic opportunity for low and moderate income persons would be the primary purpose of this funding. For CARES Act, as we all know, a little bit more recent, March 27th of 2020, which is going on 2 years ago, but in many ways, because COVID time is not the same as real time anymore, feels like about 200 years ago, the president signed what we call the CARES Act, right? The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act into law. Shorthand, CARES Act. Thankfully, they came up with a name that has a really good acronym, because otherwise it would be a mouthful every time we talked about it. And the CARES Act covered a lot of different things. It's not just about CDBG. It's not even just about HUD programs. But what it did do is award $5 billion in supplemental funds to the Community Development Block Grant Program to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus, right? PPR. And those are those CDBG-CV grants, those additional allocations, appropriations that each community that receives regular CDBG funds received. It specifically shows up in Title 12, Division B. And then similar to the regular program, where you have a statute or law and then a regulation, for the CARES Act, we have the law, the CARES Act, and then rather than something in CFR, we have a published Federal Register notice, which is how the information about the specifics of how the program's really going to run gets published, right? So in this instance, we're talking about the Federal Register notice that specifically laid out the rules, waivers, and very, very important term, alternative requirements. Okay? For those of you who have unfortunately been in circumstances that have led you to have disaster recovery funds, you will be familiar with the term alternative requirements. These alternatives are where you find the flexibility that comes with the CARES Act funding. All right, so it's really important not only to know CDBG, but the whole reason for adding in the CV piece to this training is to make sure that you're aware of the flexibilities and the additional opportunities that are provided with these funds. Okay. So while regular CDBG has those 3 primary objectives, right? Decent housing, suitable living environment, economic opportunity. CDBG-CV really has 1, right? Because it's a very specific appropriation and it is only to be used for activities that prevent, prepare, or respond, again, PPR, to coronavirus. Okay? So if you want to do something that's eligible for CDBG, but doesn't meet that test, you cannot use your CDBG-CV funds for that activity. So these funds are only to be used for things where you can document the tieback, right, to the fact that carrying out that activity, delivering that service, prevents, prepares, or responds to coronavirus. Now, as we talk about alternative requirements and waivers, it's important to note that as the notice outlines, HUD doesn't say that there's anything in the regular CDBG-CV program that you can't do. Okay, so there's nothing that is fundamentally off the table if it's eligible for the Community Development Block Grant Program. The test is whether or not it meets that tie back to PPR. Okay. So you start again from the foundation of CDBG, and then you put that through our little funnel, our wormhole, our test of how does doing that tie back to preventing, preparing, or responding to coronavirus. So we start with CDBG-CV, we layer on the CV alternative requirements, and waivers, and then we figure out how the heck are we gonna get all of this done? Rudy and I have been in lockstep with communities around the country for the last 2 years, trying to answer that exact question, trying to figure out how to make all of this work when there are capacity issues and people are working remotely. And right now, so many of us have staff that are out because they're currently testing positive for the new variant. So there are a lot of challenges, not only with our reality of living in this environment, but also in figuring out how to serve our communities. So it's more important than ever that we have partners, right? And HUD has great partners, all of whom are identified for the regular program and are absolutely able to be used for CDBG-CV. So obviously you all, entitlement communities and states and units of general local government, or as we affectionately call them, UGLUGs. Okay. So our government partners, folks who, like yourself, are working this program, are administering it, are responsible for compliance on a day-to-day basis. But there's so much work to be done that in most instances, all of the work is not being directly delivered by the jurisdictions, right? You in turn are seeking out partners to work with you to deliver these services and outcomes to your communities. And those might be subrecipients, it might be community-based development organizations, CBDOs. It could be community development financial institutions, CDFIs, and we'll talk about what all of those are in just a moment. Could be contractors. Okay? So it's important for you to know that your partners can be the same for the CV program. The requirements on them are very similar. Okay. And they continue to align to the requirements of 2 CFR Part 200. So as I'm sure you all know, 2 CFR Part 200 has very specific definitions of what's a subrecipient versus what's a contractor. And it's important in your process and in your selection process that you recognize that CDBG aligns to that and has to follow 2 CFR Part 200, as does CDBG-CV. So that requirement, 2 CFR Part 200, does not go away just because we're talking about this CDBG-CV program. So a subrecipient is a public or private nonprofit organization that gets their money from a grantee, probably you, for eligible activities. There are some very specific instances where it could be a for-profit, such as assisting a micro enterprise, but in about 99.99% of the universe, subrecipients are nonprofit organizations. If a nonprofit is acquiring or rehabbing housing, generally they're not considered a subrecipient if that's the only activity that they're carrying out under that agreement, right? So again, I said you have to determine if somebody's a subrecipient or if they're a contractor / developer. And one of the easiest ways, kind of the shorthand way to think about that is, are they running a program for me or are they doing a project? Okay. We're talking about nonprofits that are probably running programs for you. So a CBDO might be a subrecipient, but they may not be. A subrecipient is based upon what are they doing? What is the activity that is being carried out? So there may be instances where a CBDO is a subrecipient. There may be other instances where that same organization is acting in a way, carrying out an activity that results in them not being considered a subrecipient. Okay? A procured contractor is never going to be a subrecipient because, again, contractors do not carry out programs. They might be providing you with a very discrete service or running a project for you, right? Rehabbing a house. But contractors are not subrecipients, and beneficiaries, the people that are actually being served or the businesses that are receiving assistance, are never going to be considered subrecipients. So beneficiaries are always sort of their very own category. And the reason why this is important is you have to have, if they're going to be a subrecipient, a written agreement, right? You have to have a written agreement with everybody, but for subrecipients, it's even more critical because they are really being your right hand, right? They are carrying out a program on behalf of you. And in most subrecipient relationships, what that means is that you are providing the funding and oversight, but they are really the ones who are running the program on a day-to-day basis, determining eligibility, providing the resources, whether they be financial or direct service. So it's absolutely critical and a requirement that you have to have an executed agreement prior to any funds being dispersed. And that written agreement has to include a number of different things. It has to include a statement of work. What exactly are they going to be doing for you? How are you going to measure that work? What is the anticipated number of beneficiaries that they're going to serve? What is the funding that you're going to provide to them to result in that, right? What are your requirements on them for record keeping and reporting? Keeping in mind that if they are a subrecipient, they are responsible for everything, all of the requirements that you are responsible for. So one of the reasons why it's so important to be clear about your relationship and whether you're a subrecipient or a contractor relationship is that your requirements flow down to your subrecipients. So uniform administrative requirements and other federal requirements that might be in 2 CFR Part 200 or Davis-Bacon or relocation, all of those wonderful things flow down. Okay. You need to be very, very clear about under what conditions they could be suspended or terminated, And if that happens, what happens to any assets that might have been purchased with your funds? Okay. There are additional requirements for subrecipients in 2 CFR Part 200, depending upon how much money they are receiving, that requires some very specific elements in the agreement related to breach and what's going to constitute breach of contract and all of those kinds of things. So please do recognize that these requirements are in the regulation for CDBG, so our friend 24 CFR 570, but there are also additional requirements in 2 CFR Part 200 that you would want to be aware of. And actually, that's a great question because I'm going to talk exactly about what a CBDO is. So thanks for asking and caring.
Dion, there's a couple of other questions that came in related to what you've already discussed. If you don't mind, I'll read it off and have you respond.
That sounds great. I'm going to drink my coffee and hopefully be able to respond.
The first question that came in is case management for youth aging out of foster care considered a tieback to COVID?
Oh, that's a great question. So obviously public services are an eligible activity under CV funds. One of the alternative requirements is a lifting of the cap, right? You can use more of your CDBG-CV funds for public services than you could usually. The question about whether or not it's a tieback is going to depend on what is the purpose of that case management. So if it's the general case management that is always provided, hopefully, to youth who are aging out of foster care in terms of, you know, where they're going and lining them up with services and housing and education, then that's sort of an ongoing service. But if it's specific to either, you know, to PPR, so how does it relate to preparing for, right, responding to, and then I always forget the third one. I think I'm like blocking it out. Preventing is kind of hard at this point. But how does that case management specifically relate to prevent, prepare, or respond? So if it is specifically around perhaps having to find them alternate resources because of COVID, or they were going to be participating in an in-person apprenticeship program that now they cannot because they're not in person, right? So on its face, it's certainly a public service activity. The question becomes, how does it specifically relate to PPR? And if you can demonstrate that, then that would be the tieback.
Next question is, is an UGLA that is awarded funds from a UC for a public facilities or infrastructure project considered a subrecipient?
That is a great question with all kinds of little acronyms. So is a unit of local government. So basically a jurisdiction that's receiving funds from another jurisdiction, right? From an urban county for public facilities or infrastructure as subrecipient. It would, again, depend on if that's the only thing they're carrying out. It would be more common that they would be considered a contractor if they're specifically, you know, doing streets or sidewalks or something like that. But it depends on what the overall purpose of that relationship is. So are they building the library and also providing programming in the library within that same agreement? Okay, so in most instances, they would probably fall into the category of contractor.
And let's do one more. I'll hold off the other two to the next Q&A session. Do all recipients have to have a 501c3?
So no. We already noted that there is a specific circumstance under which a for-profit entity, when serving micro enterprises, might actually be considered a subrecipient. They are required to be a public or private nonprofit. So a public nonprofit is not a 501c3. right? So they might be a nonprofit corporation, but they do have to be either a public or private nonprofit. You can require that if they are a private nonprofit, that they do have 501c3 status. And that's not a bad plan, right? Because it can be some indication of capacity to make sure that they're able to file that paperwork and get that designation. So it's not a requirement, but certainly might be something that you might want to require of the private nonprofits who participate in your funding.
Actually, I'm going to throw one more at you, Dion, because I think it's a timely one. Says our CV grant was used for small business assistance where we gave the business direct funding. Our agreements named the business as a subrecipient. Should we not have done it this way? And how do we correct this?
Great question. So I said a couple of slides ago that beneficiaries are never subrecipients. And that's really important because of the requirements that come with being named a subrecipient. How to fix it is not that difficult. I would recommend that you just do an amendment to that agreement that clearly defines the relationship. Have it executed and attached. What you would want to do, however, in addition to just changing the name of the relationship, is look at that agreement and make sure that any requirements that might be in it because they're being called a subrecipient are potentially removed, right? So I said earlier that if somebody's a subrecipient to you, everything you have to do, they have to do, uniform administrative requirements and procurement and relocation, all of those kinds of things. And so you can amend the agreement, but you also want to make clear that you're not just changing the name, you're also potentially removing some of the compliance requirements from that agreement as well. So, things happen, not that hard to do, absolutely can be fixed, but it might be more than just a name change in terms of removing some of those requirements at the same time. So, Rudy, with that, do you want to keep going on the slides and then we'll come back in a few minutes and do some more?
Yeah, let's go ahead and continue.
Sure. So back to our good friend CBDOs, community-based development organizations. For those of you who have dealt with the home program and know what a community housing development organization or Chodo is, a CBDO is not that different, okay? And since CDBG came first, we can probably figure out how we got to Chodos. Again, it is a regulatory entity. It's defined in the CDBG-CV regulations. And CBDOs or SBDOs, or however you want to pronounce it, because we all like to say things in a fancy way, are nonprofit organizations, and they do have to be nonprofit, that are community-based, that only carry out certain types of projects, and everything they do, not just with your funding, but in general, has to fall into one of three categories. It either has to be neighborhood revitalization. Now, clearly that's a pretty big category to fit into, right? Or community economic development, again, not a small option, or energy conservation. If everything they do fits into one of these three categories, and again, these are pretty broad, then they could be considered a CBDO. Now, they don't have to be a CBDO to be a subrecipient. They may or may not be. The reason why it matters is that if you have activities being carried out by a CBDO and you recognize them as such, there are some additional flexibilities within the regular CDBG program. So we're not even talking about CDBG-CV. there are some flexibilities within the regular program that relate to the role of community-based development organizations. And it has implications related to program income, right? Whether or not they can have it or keep it and what it looks like, reversion of assets, what's going to go into that written agreement, right? I just talked about how important it is to be aware of what the compliance requirements are that are in a written agreement, especially, you know, subrecipient versus beneficiary, but also CBDOs. And then again, uniform administrative requirements. So it's important to be clear about sort of how you're treating them and recognize that there may be activities, whether for CDBG or CDBGCV, where an organization qualifies as a CBDO and you're looking for that additional flexibility that can come with recognizing them as such. And there are a couple of those. They're in the regulation. They're talked a lot about in some of the resources that are on the HUD exchange related to sort of administering programs and managing subrecipients. You know, the ability to construct new housing, which is generally prohibited, is potentially allowed only for CBDOs in certain circumstances. So again, there are some flexibilities to just be aware of when you're considering that. But if you don't need those flexibilities, it might be easier for you to just have a regular subrecipient relationship with them. So we talked about subrecipients, we talked about CBDOs, CDFIs, community development financial institutions. So unlike a CBDO, which is a construct of HUD, right? HUD came up with the term, HUD defines who can be a CBDO and who can't, what the qualifications are. CDFI is a treasury term. So it is a community-based lending institution, and you can actually go onto the Treasury website and see all of the registered CDFIs in your area, because whenever they get the designation, they have to identify what their service area is going to be. But they're basically banks that are primarily for the purpose of lending, that are community-based, and they have to have these following characteristics, right? So they have to promote community development. They have to serve what's called an investment area, which is usually an area that's historically been disinvested in, or a targeted population that has historically had trouble accessing lending. Their purpose is to provide loans or investments and development services. So they're really there to help entities who are working in the community development arena or who are serving investment areas or targeted populations, right? They're not a government entity. They are a financial institution. Very often they are an affiliate partner of a name you might know well, like Bank of America, or JP Morgan Chase, or Wells Fargo, or in Texas, we have all kinds of local banks, Frost Bank and Region Bank. Often they have a CDFI spinoff, affiliate, you know, extra hand over here that is specifically purposed to manage their investment in target areas and target communities. And again, the purpose of identifying the community development financial institutions, your CDFIs, is because there are additional flexibilities for the regular program if a CDFI is actually carrying out an activity, okay? And it doesn't matter if they have treasury money or not. You still get the flexibilities within the CDBG program. And one of the biggest ones of these is the ability to aggregate jobs. Now, unfortunately, I'll be talking more about this tomorrow morning because I'm doing the economic development session where we get to talk about aggregating and the pain that can be aggregating jobs created and retained. So we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but just know for general purposes that it can be helpful. Okay, doesn't have to be done, but it can be helpful depending upon the kind of program that you're running and the small businesses that you're targeting and where you're trying to serve and those kinds of things. So similar to a CBDO, CDFIs give you very specific flexibilities that you want to be aware of, whether or not you choose to take advantage of them. You are not required to utilize CDFIs. You're not required to use CBDOs, but we do want you to be aware of the fact that both of these entities are specifically called out in the CDBG regulations. And when you are, now this slide says activity selection process. I frankly more think of it as your partner selection process, but the idea again is that especially with all the extra money running around these days, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to be able to administer, run, deliver, and make happen all of these programs all by yourself. So you probably already have some partners. You might be expanding your partnerships. You might be looking for new partners. But when we're talking about subrecipients, CBDOs, and CDFIs, you can choose them in a variety of different ways, right? And there are sort of the four most common approaches to identifying your partners. There's the formal application where you actually put out an RFP or a notice of funding availability or an invitation to apply, right? It's posted on your website. You have these days an application webinar answering questions, right? It's a very formal process. There's a deadline, right? It's very public. Anybody who meets the requirements can apply. You can also choose in these circumstances with subrecipient CBDOs or CDFIs to do a limited application process. Perhaps you're going out to a subset of organizations who you know already have the particular expertise and hopefully capacity these days to help you with whatever you're trying to accomplish. And you're running a limited application process, which means it might be faster. It might not be up on the website, right? You're going to a pre-existing pool and trying to find somebody, a subrecipient, to carry out a specific type of program for you. You might do an RFQ, a request for qualifications, which is a little different from a RFP and is really about kind of building your stable, right? So trying to come up with who are all the folks in your community who are not only have the capacity to provide these services, but want to work with you. Because we all know that there are organizations in our community who might shy away from participating in federally funded programs. And then finally, you might also have an open door process where they bring programs to you, or they come to you and say, look, we're your local food bank. And if I live in San Antonio and our food bank went from serving 60,000 people a month to 60,000 people a week during coronavirus, and they went to everybody they could find and said, we need more money, okay? So, City of San Antonio didn't necessarily have a formal application out looking for, but they went to them unsolicited and requested additional funds. And as the last bullet says, you don't have to pick one, okay? So you might use different approaches for different purposes. Certainly in the rollout of CDBG-CV, it was like, who do we already know? Who do we already have? Whose contracts or written agreements can we just amend and add more money to? Right? And then once we get the bases covered, now we can go back and look at if there are remaining gaps and how we might find those partners, right? So it's absolutely okay to use a variety of methods in identifying your partners, recognizing, of course, that at the end of the day, you're still responsible for everything they do. So you want to still be just a little finicky and make sure that they're really going to be able to serve the community in the way that you and your community need them to, and in a compliant manner as well. So with that, before we move on to the next section, Rudy, do you want to do any more questions?
Yes, and I'm going to start with a Chodo question since we were just on the subject. It says, does limited application process apply to Chodos?
So Chodos are a different program. That is the home program. And Chodos, again, it depends on how you're going to be treating them. Are they going to be a subrecipient running a program, or are you going to be treating them as a contractor, right? And so you have to keep in mind what the relationship is. And the relationship is based upon the activity that they're carrying out for you. So if they are actually carrying out a program and are a true subrecipient, then you would look at the subrecipient model. But if they are acting as a contractor or developer, then you need to look at the requirements for those types of relationships. And the foundation for a lot of this conversation is not only the program regs, which for home are 24 CFR Part 92, but also 2 CFR Part 200, which are the OMB financial management requirements and uniform administrative requirements.
Then I'm going to actually combine two questions since they're both talking about the same subject matter.
Oh, you're getting fancy.
Yeah. It says, can you suggest resources to use when creating engineer, architect, and construction contracts for public facilities and infrastructure work? Since it's different from subrecipient agreement, what should those contracts contain? And the second part is there a template that is available, a sample agreement for subrecipients?
So I'm going to take the easy one first, which is yes, if you go on the HUD exchange, there are templates for subrecipient agreements. And you can look in a couple of different places, and Rudy might be able to add on to this as well. But I know that in the Neighborhood Stabilization Program toolkit, there are templates that could be modified for this purpose, as well in the Disaster Recovery Toolkit. There are templates, and there's actually, when you're talking about procurement, which is kind of what these are getting to, there are some great resources on the HUD website. And one of them, even though it's disaster recovery related, the Buying Right Guide is a really good general procurement resource that HUD has put together. And even though it's specifically for CDBG-DR, most of it applies to the general CDBG-CV program and CDBG programs as well. To the second question, it is likely that your relationship with them is more of a professional services agreement relationship. And so if you think about what your professional services agreements look like, whether that is for consultants who might write your consolidated plan, or for a fair housing agency who's doing a study for you, right? Your A&E is usually a professional services agreement, and it is likely that your purchasing department already has a template, and then what you are adding in to make that your template are the requirements of 2 CFR Part 200 to the extent that they apply, and obviously 24 CFR Part 570, which is the CDBG requirements. And if it's CV funds, adding in the CARES Act language and the Federal Register notice language as well.
Yes, and I will add that for subrecipient agreements, there's a very good template. There's a HUD document called Managing CDBG, a guidebook for grantees on subrecipient oversight. It's a simple template, but it's a good starting point.
It's a great resource. I actually like that whole book, to be honest. And
Yes.
it's not a big book. It won't keep you, like, you won't be reading it for weeks. Like, it's a guide. Don't get afraid by the word book.
Next question. Can you cite an example where a cooperative can be used for professional services or grant administration?
That is a very specific question. And so grant administration, there are some parts of grant administration that are considered inherently governmental activities that HUD does not like to see outsourced. So I just want to preface the rest of my response with that, right? That there's really no ability to hand off your program in its entirety to another entity. You still have to provide some level of oversight, even of whoever you bring on as a professional services provider, to provide some of the direct administration. That being said, a professional services falls under a contractor relationship. So you would be following 24 CFR Part 570, as well as 2 CFR Part 200 in the procurement requirements for how you procure that cooperative. So they would not be a subrecipient if they're doing your grant administration. They would be a professional service, as you noted, and they would need to be procured as such.
Okay, next question. Relating to the primary objective of the CARES Act, how is a determination if a proposal meets the CARES Act requirements made? That is on a case-by-case basis, or have standards between created to determine if a proposal does not relate to dealing with COVID. I think it has to do with the PPR, if I understood that correctly.
Okay, so when we're talking about preparing, preventing, and responding to coronavirus, right? And perhaps you're taking in applications and trying to figure out which ones you can fund and which ones you cannot. The good news is that you have some flexibility in setting up what your standards are. The bad news is that you have some flexibility in setting up what your standards are. The idea that I would say is, part of it is, what is your priority? So not just is it a tieback, but is it the tieback that you are looking for? So for example, in the very beginning, we were all focused on response, right? We weren't trying to prevent, we weren't trying to prepare. It was like, respond, what do I need right now? I need to order 10,000 masks and figure out how to get those, and hand sanitizer by the barrel load, and all right. So you have to be clear on what kinds of ways you're looking for your funding to be used in terms of meeting PPR. And then whatever that is, so say, for example, you're not interested in creating jobs, you only want to retain, all right? You can make that decision. And then what becomes important is your consistency in applying that. So once you decide what your requirements are and how you want to utilize the funds, and therefore sort of how you're looking at PPR, what you want to make sure of is within that, you are consistent in how you're applying it.
Great. We'll take a couple of more, and then we'll move on and maybe answer the rest of these towards the end.
Okay.
Can a developer set up a sideline nonprofit that would also be a CBDO?
Ooh. So, sure. And here's why it doesn't often happen. So a CBDO, we didn't spend a lot of time going over the specific requirements from a formation perspective. Not only does it have to be community-based, and does it have to, be a 501c3 nonprofit, it has to have, similar to a Chodo, a very specific board makeup. And it also has to have, specific service area. So a lot of times it's the board makeup requirement that deters a developer. Essentially, that developer would not be able to control the CBDO because of the way that the board requirements are laid out. It might happen especially if you have a nonprofit developer who is already in the community and is maybe a Chodo, but wants to create a separate entity to be a CBDO. I don't know why they would want to. So it's not impossible, but because of the requirements of formation for a CBDO, it's usually pretty unlikely.
Okay, so you've got two questions that are very similar regarding competitive and non-competitive process. When you say that we can use the unsolicited process to select activities, are you referring specifically to CDBG-CV, or does that also include CDBG entitlement funding?
Okay. So, couple of things here. Really important to note that we're talking specifically about subrecipients. So this does not apply to contractors, right? This specifically flexibility is for subrecipient relationships, and it does apply to both CDBG and CDBG-CV, and it may be utilized, with the only caveat being that obviously you have to consider the implications for that in terms of transparency and fairness of process and public perception, and all of those other things. But technically it does apply specifically to subrecipients for both programs. All right. Do you want to? Yeah. One more? Okay.
Just do one more and then we'll move on. This is a CBDO question. So.
Oh no, I was hoping I'd get through without any I couldn't answer.
As we require a review of organizations via applications to verify that they are true CBDOs, it is considered good practice to verify their financial organization aligns with Title 12, Chapter 47, to consider them a CDFI before contracting. If so, how does HUD have any checklist for us to follow?
So that's a great question, because as I noted earlier, there are really specific requirements for CBDOs, right? And we all have a little checklist to make sure that they meet those requirements. It's probably a little easier with a CDFI because they have their filing documentation and their publications on websites. I'm trying to think of if I know of a specific checklist for a CDFI. I can't think of one offhand, and I'll take a look around. The one thing that occurs to me is there might be one in the monitoring handbook, because if you're utilizing some of the flexibilities and have a CDFI carrying out the activity, there might be something in there, but I have to be honest, I'm not entirely certain. If there isn't, then actually that would be the regulation, and the monitoring requirements would be good resources for creating the checklist. And Rudy, I don't know if you might know of one offhand.
I do not, unfortunately.
All right. Well, in that case, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I will take over trying to manage all of these great questions.
Great. Can you all see my slide? Is that showing up correctly?
It is.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dion. A lot of great information, a lot of great questions. And we still have, I'm sure, more that will be coming in. So in this next section, we're going to discuss the consolidated plan relative to the CDBG program, and as Dion indicated, it's the baseline foundation for the CDBG-CV program. So it's going to be a combination of the two. We're going to share a few slides that are more specific to CV and the alternative requirements that are associated with the CARES Act or CDBG-CV program. In addition, we're going to be discussing reporting requirements, the record keeping requirements, and then we're going to end today's session discussing eligible activities. And you will find, as Dion indicated earlier, that there is a plethora of activities that we can fund with CDBG and CDBG-CV funds. So for those of you, and I believe most of you, have been involved with the administration now of CDBG or CDBG-CV grant funds, you know that you can't just start spending money on activities until you've determined what your needs are, what your priorities are for your community. Many of you undergo an annual process of determining what programs and activities you're going to be funding with your CDBG funds, whether it's through a NOFA process or any other type of process. And as you go through that process, you realize that you don't have enough money to fund everything that you want to fund or to address all of the needs of your community. So as a result, you have to establish how you're going to make strategic use of these limited funds. And these will be done in coordination with other community development resources or leverage funds. We always look to see how we can leverage funds as part of our CDBG grant funds. In fact, it's something that we report in IDIS. Are you leveraging funds, and how much did you leverage as you implemented this activity? The document where you quantify your needs and where you identify your priorities for the CDBG investments as well as for the CDBG-CV funds is known as a consolidated plan. The regulations that govern the consolidated planning process are found at 24 CFR Part 91. So anytime you're working with a con plan, you're going to refer to 24 CFR Part 91, outlines all of the requirements for your consolidated plan. The consolidated plan addresses your local plan for the use of CDBG, CDBG-CV, as well as other CPD grant funds that you receive on an annual basis. For those of you who are not aware of that term, CPD, Community Planning Development Funds, it basically is your CDBG, home, HOPWA, and ESG grant funds that are entitlement type grant funds that entities receive on an annual basis based on qualifying criteria. HUD requires that as a grantee that you submit a consolidated plan to HUD on a 3 to 5 year basis, and that time period is dependent on you. Some agencies or grantees like to submit one every 3 years. Some will wait every 5 years, but you cannot exceed that 5 year period. The consolidated plan describes your jurisdiction's community development priorities, and it also describes your multi-year goals based on an assessment of your housing and community development needs, on an analysis of housing and economic market conditions for your community, and it looks at available resources to address all of these needs. The basic idea is to utilize these resources to address the community needs and to improve the quality of life at the local level of your residents. And this is done with, the input of community stakeholders, as well as, the general public, your community, your residents. So there are 5 main components to the consolidated plan. And we start with the lead agency description. So in this section, you describe the agency or entity that is responsible for preparing the consolidated plan. You also list those entities that will be responsible for the administration of each of the CPD grant programs, as well as the funding sources. So if you are receiving CDBG and home funds, it's not unusual for one department to be responsible for managing the CDBG funds, while it's the housing department that manages the home funds. So you want to describe those. The next component is housing and homeless needs assessment. So in this section, you evaluate your entity's household income, your tenure, housing costs as a function of household income. You look at disproportionate needs amongst racial and ethnic groups, and you also look at public housing needs. In the homeless needs assessment section, you're going to examine the sheltered and unsheltered homeless populations to inform your strategy in addressing the homelessness during your consolidated plan period, whether it's the 3-year or 5-year period. The third component is housing market analysis. In this section, you want to evaluate your housing market conditions, including housing supply. You look at housing demand, as well as the condition of your housing stock and the cost of housing in your particular community. The next component is the strategic plan, and this is the section that we are referring to all the time when we're looking at our consolidated plan. In this section, you establish your housing and community development priority needs, as well as the strategies for the investment of your CDBG funds over your particular consolidated plan period. These priority needs and goals that are established in your strategic plan are based on the analysis of the information that you are utilizing to develop your consolidated plan. And this includes housing and community development data that is required by HUD as part of the preparation of your consolidated plan. And the last component is the 1-year action plan. Oops, sorry. I moved that slide. My apologies here. Did I go too far? There we go. So the last section is the 1-year action plan. In your 1-year action plan, you describe how you're going to be investing your CDBG and your CDBG-CV grant funds during the program year in support of the goals that you established in your strategic plan. The consolidated planning process requires citizen participation. It's an important element in the development of your consolidated plan. The first step that you want to take in your citizen participation process is to prepare and adopt a citizen participation plan. The plan should outline how people in your community, in your jurisdiction, will be informed about planned activities and have an opportunity to comment on your proposed activities. Part of the citizen participation process also includes making the draft of the consolidated plan available to the public. And this is done through various means. Each jurisdiction is a little bit different, but you want to make sure that it's available so that your residents can inform themselves about the proposed programs that you are looking to implement with your CDBG and CDBG-CV funds. The consolidated plan must be submitted to your local HUD field office at least 45 days prior to the start of your program year. And by the way, different grantees have different program years, so it's not always a specific time or July 1st or October 1st. It varies based on each individual grantee. The majority of grantees, however, typically have a July 1st or an October 1st start date. Given the wide variety of the program year start dates, this means that again, grantees are submitting comp plans to HUD at various times of the year. All activities that you're proposing for funding must meet a priority need and a strategy under your consolidated plan and action plan, which is why I said, when we talked on the prior slide about the strategic plan, I said, this is the section that you're always coming back to, because that outlines what your strategic plan goals are, your strategies and your goals for that consolidated plan period. If for some reason an activity is not currently described in your consolidated plan or your action plan, then you must amend that plan prior to funding that activity. At the end of each program year, you'll be required to submit a performance report as measured against your consolidated plan goals and activities. And we'll talk about reporting performance reports in the latter part of this session. In the next few slides now, we're going to focus on the CDBG-CV aspect of the consolidated plan and action plan. So we'll talk about, as Dion indicated, the alternative requirements. We're going to look at waivers and how when you have the CDBG program, and again, as Dion indicated, as the baseline foundation for the CDBG-CV program. So everything starts at the CDBG level. We have alternative requirements that have been added under the CARES Act. And so the next few slides are going to go more into detail on how those apply to your grant.
So Rudy?
Yes.
Before we dive into the CV side, you want to just take a couple of quick questions?
Sure.
Because they're definitely more general than just CV.
Absolutely.
So the first one, I'm going to, start you off with a softball here. Is the grantee required to submit the notice for review to the local CPD rep?
Local review. So we're going to actually talk about submitting. Is this for the CV or just in general?
Well, it says in general, but the question is specifically, are they required to submit the notice? Oh. Right, when the notice where you're publicizing availability for review to their local CPD rep.
Yeah, so normally that is one of the documents that you want to include as part of your submittal package, proof of publication that you made the plan available to the residents of your community.
Great, thank you. And then the second question, so our consolidated plan is through program year 2023. Can we adopt a new plan before the current con plan is completed if we want to identify revised and updated strategic objectives for our community?
Yeah, so let's say that you currently have a 5-year consolidated plan that ran from 2018 to 2022, or the basically middle of 2023. Then you're going to start one anyways. But let's say that your con plan is a 2020 through 2024, which goes through, let's say, the middle of 25. Once you go through that 3-year period, there's nothing that prevents you from saying, we're going to say that that's a 3-year consolidated plan, even though we had said 5. We want to submit a new consolidated plan, and although it's not common, especially in these times, conditions have changed. Your needs have changed. Normally, we tell grantees that over a 3-year period of time, the community needs or the circumstances of a community really don't change much. Sometimes they don't change much over a 5-year period. But given the current conditions, things may have changed drastically in a community. And the idea behind the consolidated plan is to assess your community needs. And if those have changed, you can go ahead and do a new consolidated plan. However, you may want to consider just amending your existing consolidated plan. It's probably an easier process, and it also allows you to say, our needs have changed. We've assessed our current needs as it relates as compared to our prior needs, and therefore we want to amend the consolidated plan to add additional strategic plan goals and to allow us to fund these other activities that are in need in our community. All right, should we continue?
Yep. Yeah, let's go ahead and then we can cover some more questions in a little bit.
Okay. And Dion, by the way, and this is for all of you, I know that there were questions that were being submitted that would have been real easy for us just to respond to your question. But a good example was the question that was submitted on subrecipient agreements. But sometimes we feel that it's important for all of you to hear that response, the question and the response, because it'll be a benefit to all of you. So we're trying not to respond directly to you, but to respond to everybody as a whole. Would you agree, Dion?
Yeah, I would say the one difference, and I am, even when I'm typing in, I'm answering publicly, but there are a few questions where the question is actually something that's going to be addressed in a later session. Yes. So like it's going to fall into financial management or public facilities. But generally, yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And when I do type the answers, everybody can see those as well.
Great. Thank you. So as I indicated, in the next few slides, we'll focus more on the CDBG-CV aspects of the consolidated plan and the action plan. As most of you have experienced, when the CDBG-CV funds were first rolled out, were allocated, you were likely informed by your HUD rep that your substantial amendment had to be made to your more recently approved consolidated plan and action plan when applying for the CDBG-CV funding. Now, we can say it's the first round of CDBG-CV funding, but even at that time, we weren't aware that there might be multiple rounds of funding. There was some thought that there might be, but there was no certainty there. So what they basically said is you will amend your most recently approved consolidated plan. This means that depending on the timing you were allowed to do a substantial amendment either to your 2019 plans or your 2020 plans. For most of you, if you were anything like most of the grantees that I'm familiar with, they wanted to roll these funds out as quickly as possible, which meant that you would have most likely amended your 2019 action plan. However, again, because the CARES Act allowed you to apply for your CDBG-CV grant funds until August 2021, some of you may have applied for your grant funds when you prepare your 2020 plans. Okay, so there's no right or wrong. It's just that HUD wanted you to make sure that you were utilizing the most recently approved action plan. In addition, if you applied for your initial CDBG-CV grant funds, which we now call CV1, and you did so by amending your 2019 plan, you would need to complete substantial amendments to your 2019 action plan when you apply for the CV3 grants or any subsequent CV grants that are allocated by HUD. In other words, to apply for CDBG-CV grant funds from any of the rounds, you're always going to amend the same year's action plan. Waivers were issued by HUD to the provisions that are found at 24 CFR 91-105. And 105, by the way, applies to local governments, whereas 115 applies to states. And 401, all these citations are referenced in this slide, 401 applies to home consortia. There are few around, but know that applies to you. If you are a home consortia, you're looking at 401. These waivers to the citizen participation process allowed you as a grantee to provide your citizens with the opportunity to comment on your substantial amendments to the consolidated plan and your action plan for a period of no less than 5 days instead of the original 30-day requirement. And this was done to allow for the expedited use of the CDBG-CV funds to address the coronavirus situation. Again, to prevent, prepare, and respond to the coronavirus situation. In addition to reducing the review period, the waivers also allowed you to determine what constituted a reasonable notice and the opportunity to comment. Given the circumstances that existed at the time for the 2020 program year, again, things were different at that time, still are. So as a result, HUD issued these waivers to the citizen participation process. You were also encouraged to amend your citizen participation plan when making the initial substantial amendment to either your 2019 or 2020 action plan when applying for your CDBG-CV grants, and to submit it for public comment at the same time. So if you opted to reduce your review period to 5 days, you had to modify your citizen participation plan to account for that. Amendments to the citizen participation plan were made to identify virtual hearings as a method of participation rather than in-person hearings. And many of the grantees that I work with In fact, probably all of them at that time all went to virtual hearings. And we had to incorporate that into our citizen participation plan. The amendment to your citizen participation plan should identify the online platforms that you'll be using for virtual hearings. And many of us had never heard of Zoom or Teams at the time, and suddenly, you know, everybody is using these platforms as a method to have meetings. Now, if you were or are using you know, some online platform, you need to make sure that the content of the virtual hearings are also made available to persons with disabilities and limited English proficiency. So you still have to ensure that those things take place. Now, this option was allowed for CDBG-CV grants, as well as for the 2019 and 2020 CDBG grants, as long as national or local health authorities recommended that social distancing and limiting public gatherings for public health purposes was still in effect. The virtual hearings required you to provide reasonable notification and access for the residents of your community in accordance with your certifications. So the virtual hearings required you to respond to all of the questions that were raised by your citizens in a timely manner, as well as making sure that there was still public access to the questions that were raised and responses to those questions that you provided. HUD also waived the requirements at 24 CFR Part 91.505, thereby not requiring you to submit your CDBG-CV substantial amendment to HUD for review and approval. Instead, you were allowed to submit your substantial amendment to HUD either as it occurred or at the end of your program year. Now, to receive your CDBG-CV funds, you were required to submit the standard SF424, SF424D, and certifications that you're required to submit with your typical action plan. So those things did not change. And again, you were required to submit those forms as certifications and forms as well. HUD also waived the what is called consistency with plan provisions that are found at 24 CFR Part 91, and it's 225 for entitlements and 325 for states. And as a result, HUD waived this regulation requiring you to certify that the housing activities to be undertaken with either CDBG, home, ESG, HOPWA, that they be consistent with a consolidated plan, strategic plan. However, big however, HUD included an alternative requirement in its place to allow you to submit those certifications at the time that you submit your next full consolidated plan, that takes place after the 2020 program year. So now we're going to move on to reporting requirements.
Rudy,
and
before we hit reporting,
sure.
Why don't we cover a couple of lingering con plan, action plan questions, and then
Absolutely.
we'll deal with our good friend, the caper.
All right.
So this question, I know you covered this a while ago, but I just want to come back to it. So because there is the waiver consideration. So the question says, publication for the annual action plan to the community is 30 days. Is that correct?
It is correct under your general CDBG program. However, with the CARES Act, you were allowed to reduce the public review period for no less than 5 days. And this applied not only to your CV funds, but it also applied to your 19 and 20 entitlement funds. However, in order to reduce the public review period, you had to modify your citizen participation plan to describe the number of days and how you were going to capture citizen participation.
Awesome, thank you. So this next question is a little different, and I think it's gonna be fun. So here's the question. When funds change from regular CDBG to CDBG-CV, do nonprofit agencies need notification 40 days beforehand? And do they need to be asked or just advised? As of this day, this amount of money is being switched to CDBG-CV. Also, should they be provided with more guidelines? So it sounds like if you want to switch out the funding for an existing agreement, what does that process look like?
So it sounds like it's a public service agency, or public service activity. What you want to do, and I think Dion kind of alluded to this in her session, and that is there's nothing that prohibits you from switching from one to another. However, you want to make sure, number one, that as it changes from one to another, that the requirements also come with it. So let's say that originally it was a CDBG activity, and now you want to move it to a CV activity. Well, we have the requirement, the tieback requirement. So that now needs to be incorporated into the agreements, and making sure that, the subrecipient's aware that they have that tieback requirement. If it's moving the other way, it's probably going to be less restrictive because you no longer have those alternative requirements, but at the same time, you may no longer have some of those waivers available to you. So in short, you can change it, but now you've got to modify, you need to amend that agreement. You need to make sure that that agreement reflects the actual grant funding source, CDBG or CDBG-CV. I hope that answers the question.
No, I think absolutely. And I would always encourage you to have that conversation with your partners in advance of making the change, and, educate them as to why the change is being made so that it doesn't feel like a kind of random administrative thing. Couple more, Rudy, and then we can move on to reporting. It was mentioned that the waiver was in effect until the end of the 2020 program year. Has this waiver expired or been extended?
So that is, it's how do I answer this question? So it is my belief, and what I'm going to recommend is go to the Federal Register notice and look at the language in the Federal Register notice and consult with your HUD rep. And the reason I say that is I don't know when this may be a slide from, a year and a half ago when we first launched, because just my understanding, and I've read the notice multiple times, and I am not sure that it actually expires in 2020. For that reason, I don't want to answer yes, it expires or no, it doesn't expire, I would say refer to the notice, Federal Register notice, and talk to your HUD rep.
Okay.
Have you heard anything different, Dion?
I have not.
Okay.
So a couple more questions. What is the expenditure deadline for CDBG-CV? And does the timeline for that start from the first grant agreement being signed or the subsequent CV award grant award?
And Dion, are you familiar with the deadline dates?
I can pull them up while you continue the reporting and share the link with people, if that would be helpful.
If you don't mind, yeah.
Okay. For how long can agencies apply for CDBG-CV? Is there an ending period? I'm assuming they mean subrecipients, right? So in that instance, it would really depend on how they're running their program.
Right.
So, what you want to factor for is making sure that you're fully obligated and fully expended by the dates required. And then I like this one because this is totally subjective. Do you think virtual hearings will continue to be allowed as a method to inform and collect public comment?
That's a difficult one. I know one specific grantee that I worked with that has now completely gone virtual and will continue to be virtual for years to come. They've made that decision. But I've only heard of one.
Yeah, and I know that there were some entities that were using virtual, at least for certain parts of their process previously. So I think that's a subjective thing. I would imagine that it will frankly largely depend on the success that an individual grantee has with that approach. If you're doing all virtual and nobody's showing up, then maybe not. Right? Versus if you're getting really good participation. And in some instances, the participation can potentially be even stronger than in person because of the flexibility that it gives people. So I think that's a solid maybe.
And going back to the prior question in terms of, can you open it back up? Can you, is there can you open up your application process? It is not uncommon for that to occur. And we've worked with a number of grantees where we anticipated that the funds would run out early on. Rental assistance program, and guess what? They didn't. They had a good chunk of money left over, and so they reopened the application period and accepted new applications to utilize the remaining funds.
And there are another. There's a lot of communities where things have changed very quickly during COVID. And so the program that you sometimes originally set out to run, by the time everything happens, isn't always the program that's still needed. And so there can be really good reasons why you would want to go back out. And then there's one more, Rudy, and then I promise we'll move on. Can you talk a bit about what the timing of the coming new program year 2022 will look like as we await a passed budget? What does this mean in terms of the RFQ process and submitting our action plans to HUD? So the life of the continuing resolution.
Yeah, I mean, if I knew that answer, when, Congress will allocate the funds and what amounts, I'd be retired because I'd be able to pop up those answers at any time for any grantee. It's unknown. I think, just what I would definitely do is sign up for many of the notices that HUD issues through HUD Exchange, and you'll get notified as events take place.
Yeah, absolutely. So Rudy, we can go ahead and continue. I will note that I'm typing the answer to the question about the expenditure deadline
Okay.
into the question, because I want it to be, it's one of those questions where I want to be really specific. And the answer that I'm providing is actually directly out of the FAQs. So this is the formal language around the expenditure requirement.
Fantastic. All right, so we'll move on to reporting requirements. How fun. The Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Report, or CAPER as it is known by its acronym, provides you with a method by which you report your accomplishments and financials for the program year. For those of you who represent states, you submit what is called a performance evaluation report, or a PER, depending on how you choose to describe it. And that's done in accordance with CPD Notice 1610. And know that that was a updated from a CPD notice from 2011. As a grantee, you're required to report on all of your CPD activities, CDBG and CDBG-DR, no exception. And you do that for the year that you are carrying out, for the program year that you're carrying out. The CAPER and the PER serve several goals for the CDBG and CDBG-CV program. And first, it provides HUD with necessary information for HUD to meet its statutory requirements in assessing your ability to carry out the relevant CDBG and CDBG-CV activities in compliance with the applicable rules and regulations. Second, it provides information that's necessary for HUD's annual report to Congress, which is statutorily mandated. And Dion talked about, the statute versus the regulation early on in this section. And third, it provides you with an opportunity to describe your own or describe to your citizens your success in meeting the objectives that you stipulated in your consolidated plan and your action plan. The CAPER and the PER involve two major parts. They are the narrative component and the financial reports, as you can see on your slide. You must also report on your CDBG-CV accomplishments in the CAPER for the year that you amended your action plan. So if you amended your 2019 action plan, you are reporting your CV accomplishments in that specific CAPER. In these activities, if these activities remain open in subsequent years, which we know that for most of us that is the case, you will need to report on them in the CAPERs associated with those program years. For the narrative component, you as a grantee are reporting on your progress in meeting your consolidated plan goals and objectives. In addition, you're providing specific narratives on affordable housing, on continuum of care, leveraging resources, which we described earlier, citizen comments, and also doing a self-evaluation of your program. Keep in mind that the narrative should assess the relationship of your use of CDBG and CDBG-CV funds to the priorities, the needs, the goals that you identified in your consolidated plan. Your CAPER should also assess your strategies and actions that are identified in your affirmatively furthering fair housing and analysis of impediments document. And for the financial reports component, your CAPER should include the financial summary reports provided basically as canned reports in the IDIS system. The CAPER or the PER is due to HUD within 90 days after the end of your program year. For example, if your program year ends on June 30th, your CAPER or your PER is due by no later than September 28th. And I always mention this because I can't tell you how often you have grantees submitting it on September 29th thinking, oh, 90 days, 3 months. It's 90 days, not 3 months. And 90 days is actually, in this case, this example that I provided is September 28th, okay? So count the 90 days. Before submitting the CAPER or the PER to HUD, you need to make sure that the performance report is available for public review and comment for a period of at least 15 days. And a copy of the final performance report that you submit to HUD should be available for public review and available to them if it is requested. Most grantees will post it on their website, so it is always available to the public. And for those of you who received CDBG-CV grant funds and amended your 2019 action plan, you were also provided a waiver that gave you 180 days to submit that specific 2019 CAPER. So record keeping requirements, and I know we have about 13 minutes left, so I won't go in a lot of detail, but I'll give you the information on where you can find a lot of this information. So record keeping, again, is an important aspect of CDBG and CDBG-CV administration. It helps to ensure that your program requirements are being met, that the costs are eligible, and that beneficiary information is documented. This is what HUD is going to look for when they come out to monitor you. I have an expression when I do the basically CDBG training and pretty much any training that involves HUD funds. And that is that what are the 3 most important things to ensure compliance in your grant funds? And number 1 is documentation. Number 2 is documentation. And number 3 is documentation. Again, it is critical that you are documenting what you do, that you're documenting eligibility, you're documenting compliance. The rule is you may have implemented an activity correctly, but if you're unable to demonstrate it through documentation, it's as if you never did it. So HUD may come out to monitor you and say, oh, so what did you do here? And you may explain it, and you explained it beautifully. However, you have nowhere to document that that's how you implemented, that's how you ensured eligibility. So documentation, documentation, documentation. For the CDBG and CV programs, at minimum, you should maintain documentation for the major categories that are listed on this slide. And again, for time purposes, I won't go into a lot of detail on all of these, but just know that, general administration records would include things such as, program applications, marketing materials, policies, and procedures. When you look at financial records, it's pretty self-explanatory of what you want to maintain in your files. Project and activities specific documents. This includes, subrecipient applications, written agreements, performance reports, national objectives. This is one of the most important, if not the most important, documents that you want to maintain, and that's documentation showing that you met a national objective, and that varies depending on which national objective you're utilizing, right? If you're using low mod area, you want to determine service area, you want to document eligibility for that service area, primarily residential, available to all. So how did you document that you met that national objective? Subrecipient oversight. So you should be, maintaining records for monitoring, letters and other records, any type of oral correspondence with them. And last but not least, you have the other federal requirements. And this, this could be a variety of things. There's going to be additional trainings going on or sessions going on in the next 2 days. Other federal requirements is one of those. But we look at documenting, Davis-Bacon compliance if you have a capital improvement project, or Uniform Relocation Act compliance. So these are the other federal requirements and what you want to make sure that you're documenting. Now, I indicated, I'm going to give you the location where you might want to, where you can go to get a lot of the information in terms of documentation, and that is 24 CFR 570.506, and I'll repeat that, 24 CFR 570.506. It's great. It's a lengthy list of, this is what you want to maintain in terms of records based on this type of national objective, activity, etc. In the previous slide, we discussed the type of records that you need to maintain to ensure compliance. In this slide, we'll discuss how long you're required to maintain those records. And it varies depending on whether you're an entitlement grantee. If you are an entitlement grantee, you must maintain the records for a period of 4 years from the date of execution of the closeout agreement. And that's the key, the last part of that phrase, the date of execution of the closeout agreement. Many of you are not closing out your grants. And remember that starts the time that gets the clock ticking. Close out your grants. Otherwise, you extend the period by which even HUD or OIG can monitor your documents, your files. For those of you who are states and UGLUGs, you must maintain records for 3 years following closeout, and there are a few exceptions to those rules. For records that are associated with individual activities that are subject to reversion of asset provisions, a building was purchased by a subrecipient to run a program, and now they're, returning the building. The building is no longer of any use. These records need to be maintained for a period of 3 years after the provisions no longer apply to that activity. So it's not just the 4 or 3 initial years after closeout. If that period is longer, you need to maintain them for a longer period. Records associated with individual activities where there are outstanding loan balances or receivables, these records must be retained for 3 years after the receivables or liabilities have been satisfied. A good example would be a housing rehab program where you loaned funds for rehab. 20 years later, they pay back the funds on that loan. Well, guess what? You had to have that file available for not just those 20 years, but an additional 3 years after that receivable was met, or that liability had been satisfied. You must also allow your citizens to have reasonable access to records and to provide them with in a timely manner. Now, I highly recommend that you also consult with your legal counsel on what documents are considered public records, or if certain documents must be redacted. You must also follow your PII policies and procedures. You should all have these, and I know you do. You also must make your program records available to HUD, Office of the Inspector General, and Controller as requested. So we'd come to poll number 2. So again, using the poll option in Slido, provide your response to the following question. Why is record keeping important for CDBG and CDBG-CV grantees and subrecipients? And you have the 4 options there. So we'll give it about 30 seconds.
And Rudy, we do have a number of questions as we run up on time.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
As people are answering the poll, maybe I can toss a couple of these out to you. And then, so one, and I think this is an important one, it says, what CFR says 4 years for entitlement funds? 2 CFR 200 does not make a distinction. It states 3 years, which makes this confusing.
Right. So what typically happens is 2 CFR is a more general requirement and says 3 years. However, if you have a specific Federal Register notice or regulation that requires more time, such as the CDBG program, which within 570, it actually states, this is going to be for 4 years, then you go with a more restrictive of the 2. In this case, it is 4 years.
Great, thank you for that. One more, and then I think we do have to wrap up just to allow people a 2-minute break before the next.
Okay.
Is there a break between? Hold on, let me look at the. Oh no, they have 15 whole minutes to get it together between now and then, so everything should be fine.
Okay.
So, how long do I have to monitor a program or activity after it is closed?
Well, I would definitely monitor it for the period of time, number one, that you have to maintain the records. And number 2, what does your agreement say? You may have affordability covenants, for example, that go beyond the record keeping requirement. They may have paid off the loan, but you still have affordability covenants. So I would, number 1, make sure that it's, the record maintenance period, and number 2, whatever your agreement says that you have to monitor.
Great. And then I think we can fit in one more. When you reference closeout, are you referring to the state closing out individual projects or HUD closing the entire grant between the state?
So it is closing the grant. Ever since we went to grant-based accounting, which is 2016, if I remember correctly, we no longer have, FIFO involved. So as part of the that requirement, each grant stands on its own. So when you receive the 2018 allocation of CDBG funds, that is a grant. Okay, it stands on its own. You draw on that, and everything you do is within that particular appropriation. And you at some point have to close out that grant. If most of you that have been around for many years, we never closed out a CDBG grant for many, many years. I've been doing this 35 years and never had to close out a grant. Well, that no longer is the case. You have to close out once you've spent all of your money, all of the activities have met a national objective, you need to close out that grant. It's no different than what you're going to do with a CV grant. It's no different than NSP. We're closing out all of these grants. There comes a point where it ends, officially ends.
Great. Thank you so much, Rudy. And I think this is the point at which we officially end this first session. I would just note that some of these closeout questions, I believe there's a session on Friday related to monitoring. And some of these closeout questions will also be covered at that time. So I would encourage you to, take a quick break. I hope you enjoyed this first session. I'm not sure what other sessions Rudy's doing, but I will be back first thing tomorrow morning talking about economic development, and then on Friday in the financial management session. So thank you so much. Grab a quick break, grab some more coffee. I think Rudy and I are now going to fully caffeinate. It's 8 a.m. West Coast time, so we're ready to go for the day. And thank you so much for participating in the CARES Act conference. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.